Hello, welcome to SQL Server Analysis Services 107, Creating Dimensions in Analysis Services 2005 and Analysis Services 2008. The good news is that working with dimensions is fairly similar between the two. The biggest difference is the wizard in 2005 asks a lot more questions than the one in 2008. The 2008 wizard is much more streamlined and doesn't do as much work for you, which may be a positive or negative depending on your view. So what I'll do in this video is run through both wizards, pointing out the differences, and then I'll get into just a generic discussion on working a little bit with these dimensions. I'll then follow on in future videos with more work on these dimensions, because dimensions are a big topic in analysis services. It's something very important. You'll spend a lot of time getting dimensions just right, modifying properties, working with them, and so it's important to cover them in detail. So this first video is going to be just about creating those dimensions and then looking at some of the property settings, and then again the next few videos I'll spend time working on modifying those dimensions. So the first thing to do is tackle dimensions in 2005, and I'll do this by running the dimension wizard. And it actually gives me more flexibility than the cube wizard. If you watch the cube wizard videos, I said in there that I don't normally build cubes just by starting with the cube wizard. It can build the dimensions for me, but I don't like it to. I don't think it gives me enough control. So I will typically use the dimension wizard first to create the dimensions, and then I'll run the cube wizard and simply use the existing dimensions. I don't let it create them for me typically. So the 2005 wizard is going to give me a lot of flexibility, and it's going to do some things for me. It's going to try to add, it is by default going to add all the attributes for me. So any column in the dimension table it will add as an attribute. It will also try to find hierarchies for me, and it may or may not do a good job of that. You'll see as I walk through the wizard. The wizard can also build a standard dimension, a time dimension, or a server time dimension. Standard is just anything other than a time dimension. A time dimension is really just a regular dimension, but by marking it as time, then there are certain functions in the MDX language, the query language for cubes, that allow me to do time-based calculations. I can do things like parallel period to say, show me the same, or show me the data for the same period last year or the same period last quarter, and so on. So there are advantages to doing that. The third option here, the server time dimension, I'll show you that option in just a moment. This will create a time dimension for me without an underlying table that has it all laid out. I simply specify the start and the end dates and what levels I want in it, and it will just generate that time dimension for me. The wizard will go on and ask me what kind of dimension, the type, and I'll point that out to you in just a moment in the wizard. It'll ask me to identify any parent-child attributes. That will be a whole nother video later talking about handling of parent-child dimensions, or attributes in this case. And then after it does all this, it will, of course, try to identify hierarchies and then actually create the dimension for me. So rather than just continue to talk about it, let me jump into Analysis Services 2005 and give you a demonstration of using the dimension wizard. Here I am in Analysis Services, BI Dev Studio 2005, and I'm looking at the data source view, the DSV. You can tell that by several things. One is the extension on the file name up here is .dsv. So that tells me it's a data source view. Also on the left hand side I have the diagram organizer, and remember from the DSV video I talked about the usefulness of having one diagram per fact table. And finally, the tables in the diagram here are not color coded. The dimension and fact tables don't have different color headers to them. So all three of those are indications that this is the DSV and not the cube view of the world. So there are a couple of things I want to do to the DSV first quickly, and one of those is I have in here the dim customer table already, and let me zoom in a little bit so you can see that better. but I happen to have in the dimension customer table a geography key, and I don't have the geography table yet. What this is going to allow me to do is I want to look at customers on a geographical basis. So I want to go from a country to a state or province to a city and then down to the individual customer. So what I need to do first is I'll simply right click and I will add a table here, and I will add the dim geography table. And once I do this, of course it will locate the join for me, and it adds dim geography. Now where it adds it is not always the best place. It's kind of the opposite corner of what I'd hoped for. So let me grab it and drag it down to the area in which I'm interested. Take just a second here. And it actually has joins to more than just dim customer. It's also tied to a resellers table. We'll talk more about that coming up in the future. But all I'm interested in right now is this tie to the dim customer table. So dim geography and dim customer. This is basically the equivalent of a snowflake dimension, and I'll put these together into a single dimension coming up. So what I'm going to do is work on this customer dimension. Now I'll go ahead and save this, and if you look along the right hand side in dimensions, I actually already have a dim customer. I'm simply going to delete that for a moment. I'm going to create a new one and add it to it. And finally, before I move on, I do want to point out one other thing about the dim customer table. Here in the DSV, I created a calculated member, actually a named calculation as it's called in the DSV, don't forget. I created a named calculation called full name, which is simply concatenation of the first name and last name. I'll use that during the wizard, which is why I wanted to point that out. So at this point, what I want to do is right-click on Dimensions, and I'm going to choose New Dimension. This will launch for me the Dimension Wizard. I'll click Next to step into it. And here it gives me two choices. Do you want to build a dimension without a data source, in other words, just generate the shell of it? Or do you actually want to do it with a data source? That's the more common of the two approaches. And I could uncheck Auto Build and just do it all manually, but I'll let it go ahead and create the attributes and the hierarchies for me. Now this is 2005, so it's going to try to throw everything in there. Remember that versus what you'll see in 2008 in a moment. So I'll click Next, and again, it can only see the data source view, so it sees the only data source view I have. I'll click Next, and this is where it gives me the choice between a standard dimension, a time dimension, and a server time. Now just if you're curious, I'll pick server time for a second and go forward, and this is where it lets you choose the beginning day and the ending day. So this would generate a dimension for me that started on January 1st, 2005, ended December 31st, 2008. First day of the week would be a Sunday, and then what time periods, right now it's just the individual date. I could say something like year, quarter, month, and then the actual day, and it would generate that whole thing for me. So that's just what that does. But at this point I want to just do a standard dimension. So I'll choose a standard dimension, and it asks for the main table. Now this is the dimension table, not a measure group or a fact table. So I'll drop this down, and what I want is the dim customer. That is going to be my main table, even though I also have dim geography in it. You'll see that in just a moment. It then asks me what are the key columns in the table. Now it does a pretty good job of figuring that out based on the primary key defined in my DSV, which in turn was read from the data source in SQL Server. So I'll just leave that as customer key. Notice it could be a compound primary key if you had one. The other thing that's optional is what column contains the member name. So even though I have customer key, looking at just a bunch of numbers may not help me very much. So I can drop this down and choose any attribute, and of course this is where I will choose that full name. Because now what will happen is when the user drills all the way down to an individual customer, they will see the customer name rather than just some ID. So at this point I'll click Next, and it asks me, okay, what are the related tables? and what do you want to use. Now, if you run through the same exercise, you might have both of these checked, but all you actually want is the dim geography in this case. So I'll say dim geography is the related table I'm interested in. And this is where it says, okay, now I want you to choose the attributes. Notice again, by default, it has selected every column in both the customer table, and if I scroll down just a little bit, you will see it has also selected everything in the geography table. You'll notice that here, dim or dbo.dim customer and then the column name, and then it switches to dbo.dim geography and the column name. Well, I don't want all of these, so I'll actually unselect them all, and this is where again you get more control over what you want to do. And I'm going to pick a very simple list here to get started. I'll pick the gender and just pick a few things that you might want to analyze by. Let's see, gender and the number of cars owned might be interesting. The yearly income might also be interesting. And I'll pick marital status. So you might want to analyze people's purchasing trends in this case by gender, whether or not they're married, how much money they make, and how many cars they own. Remember, this is the fictional data for a company that sells bikes, so the number of cars that they own might be very important. Further, I'll come down here, and this is a little bit interesting. You have a state province code and a name. You have a country region code and a country region name. In this case, it's an English country region name. I'll just go ahead and choose the names to make this easier to see. So I'll choose the English country region name and the state province name and then the city. So I'll leave it at that. And then I'll click next, and it asks me what dimension type this is. There's regular, and there are a number of other types, and one of them is in fact customers, which is what I'm doing. If you choose one of these others, it simply says, oh, in a customer dimension there's normally a customer, there's a customer household, there's a full name, there's a first name, all these others, and you simply map what is in your dimension into these. I don't really have a need to do that at this point. I'm going to leave it as regular for now and click next. This next step of the wizard asks me to identify any parent-child relationships. I don't have any of those in this. A normal example is an org chart where you have employees reporting to other employees, and that they're all in the same table. They're in one table, but you have a hierarchical structure in that table. I don't have that here. Again, this will be the subject of a future video. And now I'll click next. It attempts to identify any hierarchies that exist, and when I click next, it did not find any in this case, which is interesting because in practicing for this video, I ran through this scenario before and it did find one. So it wasn't right, the one that it found, but that's okay. I'll go ahead and click next, and at this point it allows me to name this. I'm going to give it a slightly different name. I'm just going to name it customer. I'll leave the rest the same and click finish. And what it does is create the dimension for me. You'll notice up here customer.dim, and it adds it to the dimensions over here, customer.dim again, and it shows me a data source view of just the tables that participate in this dimension. It shows me a list of the attributes, and it shows me the hierarchies, which I don't have any. So at this point I'm done with the 2005 wizard. So now let's contrast that to the 2008 wizard, and then I'll come back and work with this dimension and show you some additional features about it. As I mentioned before, the 2008 dimension wizard is much simpler than the 2005 dimension wizard. Very fewer steps and more streamlined, trying to get you there faster. It also tends to take the opposite approach. It throws in almost nothing by default, much as you saw with the cube wizard. It does have a few more options when it comes to building the dimensions. It can build from a table, which again is the default. It can actually create a time dimension table back in the source. It can create a time dimension without a table, in other words, the server time dimension option that you saw in the 2005 wizard. It just creates a time dimension that's filled with data in the cube, but it's not based on any actual source. and then it can create a non-time table. In other words, it can create a table back in the source, but it's just based on some structure you define as you walk through the wizard. So that just creates the shell of what that looks like. So that's the 2008 wizard. Let's actually go in and take a look at running this, and you'll see the difference between this and the 2005 wizard. So here I am in BI Dev Studio for 2008, and I'm going to quickly go over the same things that I had before in 2005. The first thing that I've done is I've already added in the dim geography table, and of course finding it will be the challenge here. Let me narrow it down to just the sub data source view, and even though you see just dim customer here, actually looks like it's off to the here's dim geography right here on this particular view. So you can see dim geography has been added in, and notice that dim customer still has a full name named calculation. So the next thing that I want to do here is remove the dim customer dimension, much as I did before, and now I will run through the dimension wizard in 2008. Starts off with a welcome screen, much like 2005. Now here you see some additional options. Use an existing table as the default. There is the generate a time table back in the data source, so actually create a physical table. Of course you have to have write permissions to do that. Generate a time table on the server. This is the same as the server time dimension in 2005. On the server sounds kind of magical, but it just creates a dimension when you deploy it and fills it with data. The generate a non-time table in the data source, again, will create an empty table in the relational data source. And if you want to use that, you can actually choose from a number of templates, and it will give you some existing fields. But as was the case with 2005, I want to use an existing table. So I'll click Next here, and again, what data source view do I want to use? There's only one I have available. And then what table, and again, this is the main table in the dimension, so I want to choose dim customer. Now again, it asks for the key columns. It shows me the one it believes is correct. I could add additional ones if I needed to. And like in 2005, it asks me what name column, what column I want to use as the name. And again, I'll scroll down and choose the full name column that I created in the DSV. Clicking Next here, it says, okay, here are the tables I see related to this dimension table, dim customer. I only want dim geography at this point. I don't want dim sales territory. And if I click Next here, it shows me all of the attributes again in both of those tables. The first is the customer table, and if I scroll down, it switches to geography. A little bit different view here, but fairly obvious to see how it's doing it. It has the key and then all the columns for that under it. So I'll go through and choose those same values that I had before. For example, I had the gender and the marital status, and I had the yearly income and the number of cars at home. It's a little bit lower, or number of cars owned. And then if I scroll down, again, I'll simply choose the English country region name, the state province name, and the city. And I'll leave it at that. Sales territory key I'll take off. I don't really need that at this point. Notice one of the things in both 2005 and 2008, if I scroll back up to the top here under customer, you don't see the full name column. I've already identified that. It's going to show up as the value for the key when someone's looking at it, so it doesn't get added as a separate attribute. I'll click Next here, and notice the wizard is done. It did not try to identify any hierarchies for me. It didn't ask me about parent-child. Didn't ask me about a type. Much more streamlined, more simple. I've renamed the dimension here just to customer. I'll click Finish, and just like you saw in 2005, it creates the dimension for me. You can see customer.dim here on this tab. If I scroll down a little bit over here, you will see the customer.dim showing up as a dimension here. And I have this data source view of just the tables participating in this. Again, here are the attributes, here are the hierarchies, of which there are none. Again, create those in a future video. So that's the 2008 wizard. So now that I have the same, or basically the same dimension in these two, I'm going to jump back into 2005 and show you some additional things about this. Now, everything I'm showing you from now on is basically generic to either 2005 or 2008, so it doesn't really matter which one you're using from here on out. In analysis services, there is a concept of a database dimension and a cube dimension, and these are two separate types of objects in a sense. The database dimension is what you've just created in the previous steps, or what you've seen me create. A database dimension is a dimension that's in the database, the analysis services database, but doesn't necessarily belong to any cube. I mean, it is a separate object outside the realm of a particular cube. And this is important because there are things that you can set at this level that you can't set well, I shouldn't say that. You can't set in a cube dimension. You have to set it to the database dimension, and then it affects that dimension's usage in all the cubes. And in addition, a single database dimension can be added to the same cube multiple times, and that's actually not as uncommon as you might think. A cube dimension is simply an instance of that database dimension in the cube, and if you look at the default AdventureWorks cube, and I'll show you this to you in just a moment, the time dimension, there's a single time dimension in the database. So a single database dimension called time, or dim time. But then the cube has three instances of it, one for due date, one for order date, and one for ship date. So they have different names in the cube, but it's still the same database dimension. And if you're curious, if you add a database dimension multiple times to the cube, the storage is only physically done once. It's not done for each instance of the cube dimension. So you can add it 3 times, for example, with the time dimension, but you're only using the storage 1 time. So that's an advantage. So I'll go in and show you this definition, but also we'll talk about the properties for a database dimension versus a cube dimension, and then for the attributes in the database dimension versus the cube dimension. Attribute properties are pretty important, and some of them only apply once we start building multiple or multi-level hierarchies, and I will build those in a video coming up very soon. But the attribute properties, even the ones that aren't targeted more towards these multi-level hierarchies, there are several that are important, and some of them you can only change at the database dimension level. You can't change it at the cube dimension level. So I'll get in and show you these items here in just a moment. In fact, let's jump right in and take a look at the database dimensions, cube dimensions, and then dimension properties and attribute properties. So here I am back in BI Dev Studio 2005 in this case, but it doesn't really matter. The things I'll show you are the same in 2008 as well. Notice again that I've created the customer dim, and it has added it to the dimensions. So these are the database dimensions here in the Solution Explorer. One called dim time, one called dim currency, dim product, dim employee, and of course customer that I just created. Now if I click on the customer database dimension, notice that I have a very limited set of properties here. Basically it's the physical file name is all I can change. Now that list of properties is different than if I click over here in the attributes area, just in a blank area. Notice that my properties window changes to the customer dimension. I can also get the same thing by clicking on the customer name here in the attributes. You can always drop this list down as well if you have trouble finding it. But I'll point out a few of these attributes to you. The attribute all member name. By default, any attribute hierarchy, which is just an attribute, has an all level. It is the sum of all of the members of that particular attribute. The default name for that is simply all. You can change that here if you want, but for now I'll leave that the same. There are several other properties, and I'll get into these in future videos, and there's some I may not ever talk about specifically. Another property that's interesting, I will talk more about when we get into the whole processing and loading of data, is the unknown member and unknown member name. Sometimes, this shouldn't happen, but it does in the real world, you'll have, let's say this is customer, you'll have a customer on a fact record, and that customer hasn't been added to the customer dimension table yet for some reason. So what do? Well, you can either reject that record and hold it out of the fact table, or you can simply give it an unknown value. And what this does is decide whether or not the unknown member should be visible and what name it should be. So when you're doing your loading, oh, this doesn't tie to a dimension table, what should I do? You can actually tie it to an unknown. That's not uncommon. No company has perfectly clean data, and therefore there's some level of unknown data in just about any company. Obviously you want that as small as possible, and some companies simply reject it and never show it, but a lot of companies want to show it to give visibility to the fact that, hey, we need to clean up this data to some degree. I'll keep scrolling down here just a little bit, and there are a few other attributes here, none of which are terribly important at the moment. There is a proactive caching and storage mode that I'll talk about later in other videos. So this is the database dimension. Now, what I'm going to do is open up the cube, and notice that there is no dim customer or customer dimension at all over here. So what I can do in this area is right click, and I can say add cube dimension, and this gives me a list of the database dimensions. So I'll click the customer dimension, the one that I just created as part of this video, and click OK, and it adds the customer dimension to my cube. Now, at this point, there are a number of things I could do. Notice, first of all, that if I click on it over here, it shows me now customer as a cube dimension. Before, it was a database dimension, or simply, well, let's go back to the dimension. Click on customer here, it's simply dimension. Once it's in the cube and I click on it, it is now a cube dimension. And there are several things that I can set about this. Don't worry about the all member aggregation usage. I'll talk about that later when talking about the aggregations and creating those on the fly. There are a couple of other things that are interesting here. One is visible. You may actually have dimensions for one reason or another that are not visible in a cube. You also have the ability to change the name of this. And that's exactly what's been done. Remember that ship date, due date, and order date are all from the time dimension. So if I click on one of those, you'll notice the dimension ID is dim time. But if I come down here, the name has simply been changed to ship date. Same thing with due date. The dimension ID is dim time, but the name has been changed to due date. So that is an instance of one database dimension being used 3 times in the cube. Microsoft calls that a role-playing dimension, and again, I'll cover that in more detail here in a future video, and talk in more detail about the different ways dimensions can act when building cubes. Now, what I've done is I have added the customer dimension to this cube. But there's a lot more to the customer dimension, so I've intentionally gone ahead and made it a cube dimension as well, of course, as the database dimension, to show you the attributes and the properties on those. So let me talk a little bit about some of these. I'm going to pick, for example, the English country region name. First of all, I think that's a pretty lousy name for an attribute. So what I'm going to do is resize this a little bit. And right now, the name is English country region name. I'm going to change this to just country. Keep it very simple. and simply call it country here. Now notice the ID stays the same. That's the name of the column in the data source view, but that's okay. I just want to call it country, and that's what the user will now see. If I scroll up here, there are several properties that are interesting. One of these is an attribute hierarchy display folder. This is simply a logical folder that you can create to group properties together. That's really all it is. So for example here, I have some geography. I'm just going to type that in this first time since it didn't exist before. And now this hierarchy, country, will be in a geography display folder. I'm going to do the same thing with city. I'll put it in the geography display folder. So I have country, city, and there is a state, province, which I will also put in geography. Then for gender, I'm going to put that in demographics, okay, information about the customer. And I'm going to do the same thing with marital status and number of cars owned, notice, and yearly income. Notice I've selected 3 of these. I just held down the control key and clicked those, and I can set all of those at once. So I'll set that to demographics. Now, it is up to the client tool that you're using to honor these display folders. It's just a way of grouping these, and it helps a lot when you have 100 attributes in a particular dimension. You just get to group them into some logical construct. So I'm going to go back to country at this point. There are some very important properties here: attribute hierarchy enabled and attribute hierarchy visible. Those are important, but I'll talk about those in the next video when we get into building hierarchies. The attribute hierarchy optimized state simply builds some additional structure when the cube is being processed. The rule of thumb here is if you're going to allow the user to analyze on this particular attribute, then leave it fully optimized. If you're not going to, then you can change this to not optimized. There are times you have attributes that you do not expect the user to ever be able to drag over and analyze the data. So I'll show you some examples of that again in some future videos. The default member is just that. By default, if you don't set this, it will be the all level if it has an all level. If it's not the all level, then it will be the first one in the dimension. But if you wanted to, for some reason, set a default, for example, this is country, and this isn't processed yet, so it can't get me a list, but I could actually just choose from a list and say, I always want you to default to United States, for example. There are a couple of other attributes after this: the discretization bucket count and method. This is useful if you have something, for example, a yearly income that is just the actual values. If you had 10,000 customers, you might have 10,000 separate yearly incomes. Well, you don't necessarily want to analyze that way. You want to put it into buckets, 0 to 10,000, 10,001 to 20,000, and go from there. Well, normally I recommend doing that in the ETL, but if you don't do it in the ETL, you can do it here. You can tell it how many buckets you want it broken into, and then how it should do it: automatic, equal areas, or clusters. Okay. Estimated count, don't worry about that for now. Again, I'll talk more about that with aggregations. Now, a couple of things that are interesting to note here. One is the isAggregatable property. This simply controls whether or not this attribute will have an all level. That's all there is to it. Well, it's not all there is to it, but at this point, that's all there is to it. Talk more about this when we get into building hierarchies, but if I were to turn this off, and in fact I'll go ahead and do that and just show you something about this, but there is no all level. I'll leave it true now. We'll process this and I'll come back and change this to false. The order by is how it should order these items, and there are 4 options here actually, and key is the default, but it can also order by name and then by an attribute key or an attribute name. This is actually pretty important. If you think about it, Let's take month, for example. You have the first 3 months of the year, and the key is probably 1, 2, 3. So if you order by those keys, it will come out correctly. However, if you were to put in the names and order by the names, it would come out as February, January, March, which I see happen fairly often. So in some cases you want that. You want it to sort alphabetically. If you have a list of customers, you want it to sort by their names. You don't care what their key is. And their key may have nothing to do with the alphabetical order of the names. In some cases, you need custom ordering that is neither by the name nor by the key value. I did some work for a major appliance company, and they wanted every report to be refrigerators, freezers, washers, dryers, electric ranges, gas ranges, in that order every time. So in that case, you would build typically another attribute. You might even have a separate table that simply lists the items in that order and puts them with a key value, and then you could sort by that other attribute. I'm going to go ahead and change this back to the default here, which is key for now. We'll spend some more time with that coming up as well. Then I'll scroll down. There are several other items. The attribute hierarchy ordered. Again, whether or not this should be ordered. If they're not going to browse by this, change this to false, so it doesn't have to create some additional structure and doesn't have to go through the ordering at the time it's processing the data. There's a parent-child section. I don't have any parent-child attributes here, so I don't worry too much about that. And then the source with the key columns and name columns, we'll get into that coming up in the video on attribute relationships. It's a very important concept. So these are the attributes here at the database dimension level. Now I'll jump to the cube dimension, and I'll go into the attributes tab here, and under customer I'll choose the same thing, country, and you'll notice it's a much shorter list. It is simply the aggregation usage, which again is default, and I'll talk more about this with aggregations, back to that attribute hierarchy enabled and attribute hierarchy visible, and in the optimized state, and that's it. There is an attribute ID. I can't change that. So let me go back to the dimension for a moment. I'm going to save all of my changes so far. And one of the things that you saw in the previous video on just quickly processing, you were basically processing the entire cube or database. Well, every dimension does have a process option here. It's the second button on the toolbar, and I can process just a particular dimension. Now in this case, the whole project's out of date, so it's going to have to upload everything and reprocess it, but bear with me for just a moment, and we'll let it run through the processing on this particular dimension. It will, again, process more. But then notice there is a browser tab for just the dimension, and I will be able to go in and browse this particular dimension, and I'll be able to show you the is aggregatable is currently true, and I'll show you the all level for that. Okay, it is now processing the time dimension, and in a moment we'll go through and process the rest of the dimensions and the measure groups. Now it is asking me to process just this dimension. Of course, again, it will have to do some additional work, but I'll go ahead and run this, and you'll see it processing the customer, reading the attributes, issuing the SQL statements. Again, select distinct for every attribute that I've chosen, and it runs through, finishes processing. And now what I can do is go to the browser for this dimension and look at these attributes. So for example, I'll pick country, and notice this is the all level I was talking about. Now one of the disadvantages of the BI Dev Studio is that if I go into the cube browser and pull over the country attribute, it doesn't show me the all. It automatically breaks it down to that first level. But if I go ahead and expand this, you can see all and then the countries listed under that. Now if I go back to the dimension structure for a moment, and under country, if I change that is aggregatable property to false, and now I tell it to reprocess, it will save this change, submit the changed statement to the server, and then it will go through the process. And once that's done, I'll be able to go back and browse this, and just like the browsing of the cube, when you browse a dimension after a change, you will have to reconnect. So the processing is finished here. I'll go back to the browser, and again I get this message down here at the bottom, and I need to reconnect. So again, the second button up here, I'll click reconnect, and notice I'm looking at country, but the all level is gone. Okay, so that's the is aggregatable property, and it does come into play when you're building multi-level hierarchies as well, which we'll look at in a future video. So what I've done here is create a dimension in both 2005 and 2008. I then added that to a cube, and I have changed some of the properties about this. And is it a perfect dimension yet? Not even close. Need to add hierarchies, and then some very important steps on top of that as well. So I'll spend a lot of time in the next few videos working with dimensions and talking about some additional steps with them. So, in summary, created dimensions with the Dimension Wizard. I generally prefer this over letting the Cube Wizard create the dimensions for me. I get more control, and I like this approach much better. Then, once I create the dimension, I can set properties in the database dimension, or once I make it a cube dimension. I can also spend time setting properties on my attributes in either the database dimension or cube dimension. When you're in the cube dimension, you have a very limited set of properties for attributes. So normally you're in the database dimension changing the attribute values or the attribute properties. What happens then is that those changes reflect in every cube that is using an instance of that particular database dimension. So again, future videos will continue cleanup on the dimensions. We will modify some more properties. I'll talk about a few other things with the properties. We'll build multi-level hierarchies, and then we'll get to the all-important topic of attribute relationships.